Hello everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and on today's product analysis, we're going to be checking out what is undoubtedly the closest thing to double tracking in a pedal format, the TC Electronic Mimiq Doubler. I can't truly begin this video without at least a brief explanation on double tracking and the doubling effect, what kind of sound that achieves, how you would replicate it in the studio, and of course in a live playing scenario. So let's start with the simplest example. Double tracking in a studio is really easy. You take what is most of the time a mono guitar sound source, so through an amplifier and a mic'd up cabinet, you track whatever you're going to track, and then you pan the first take 100% right. You track that same, how many ever bars you just tracked there, you do the same thing, you paint it 100% left. You've essentially just double tracked. The cool thing with double tracking, quad tracking, and multi-tracking guitars in general is that you end up with a very wide stereo image. It's as if both guitars are coming at you from 180 degrees apart, especially if there's another guitarist playing the other side. And the reason that occurs is because there's slight imperfections between the way each guitarist is playing, or even each take is from the same guitarist. And that comes in, time-based errors, whether it be your pick attack was 3 milliseconds before this one, or maybe you bent the string a little different, making some pitch errors, and it just sounds good. That's a really nice effect that people like to hear on albums because it is wider, it's thicker, it's fuller. And when you see a live band and there's two guitarists, that's generally what you're hearing is a double tracking sound, since generally they're kind of panned 100% either way. The tricky scenario arises with a single guitarist band that wants to kind of emulate that sort of effect in a live scenario, or especially if you're just jamming at home alone. And that comes in a few forms. There's a lot of traditional ways people have attempted to make those sort of sounds with one guitar to varying degrees of success, and I've never been really all that impressed with them. So one of the more traditional ways is this thing called the Haas effect, and generally you take a 7 to 30 millisecond delay and you just apply it to one channel. So say your right channel will be behind the left channel by 7 to 30 milliseconds, and it sounds okay, but at the end of the day, it doesn't sound like the same type of effect as double tracking. It loses a lot of the depth. You have to do some volume compensation to make up for the fact that your ear hears one channel louder than the other, even though they're at the same volume. And if you sum all that to mono, it really goes bad. And these are things that I generally don't replicate because I just don't think they sound all that good. The Fractal audio firmware, as well as I think even the Line 6 Helix, has a doubler, and in the Fractal stuff it's called an enhancer, and that can vary from a more modern take that does some well to mono, and others like the classic that does sound wider, but at the end of the day it's still not a true double tracking sound. Enter the Mimiq Doubler, and this is a product that's been out for quite some time, though I didn't know of its existence until fairly recently. And upon reading the product description and its name, I was thinking what probably a lot of you are, and that was, yeah, right. How many times have I heard these claims? How many times have I heard, oh, we're going to turn a stereo guitar rig into sounding like a full band, and it just ends up being another single channel fixed delay pedal that is really not convincing in the least. But then I heard some sound snippets from this thing, and well, I was intrigued. So I figured I had to grab one to see if I could translate those results to my real rig, as well as see how it works in some unconventional methods, if it could be an actual replacement for double tracking. And just really, I want to know how they do it. And so we'll be doing a little bit of light waveform analysis and seeing exactly what's going on under the hood of this thing. So how this thing works, or at least how TC Electronic intends for this to work, is you would run a dry guitar signal into the mono input, or if you're playing in front of clean amps, then you could do, say, like a stereo delay reverb chorus in front of this, and that's why you have a stereo in option, which is nice. But on the output, you would run this into the front of whatever sound sources you're using. It's supposed to be like dual amplifier rigs, but I'll show you, you can actually do a little bit more than that. My word of caution with this pedal is if you have only a mono guitar rig, whether that be a single combo or a 4x12 half stack and a mono amp head, don't bother with this. This is a useless product for mono players. You do not get the same sort of stereo width no matter what way you try to crack it in a mono type of sound setup, and I think this mono output is pointless because of that. You get a really bad chorus effect when you use it that way, and because of it I'm not even going to show you what it sounds like because it's freaking pointless. This is a stereo rig pedal in my opinion. Well, it's kind of fact. It has stereo ins and outs, so hard to argue with that. Controlling this pedal is fairly straightforward. So this mini switch allows you to select the amount of dubs, with one dub basically equaling standard double tracking. This will basically have a dry signal on one channel and your new magic sauce duplicated double track sound on the other channel, whereas 3 dubs is more or less a quad track sound, with even the dry channel having this mangled duplicated version over top of it. And on the 2 dubs option, I think it's only the dry channel that gets another dub on top of it. I barely ever use 2, don't really like the sound of it, but 1 and 3 in the right cases can sound really cool. On the 1 dub version, basically dry and effect are your left and right channel controls, depending on which way you have this thing set up in front of amps. And then on 3, I do find it pretty good to bleed in and out the effects based on what I'm playing. So generally keep these things maxed out, but you might find that for some of your material, it's good to play with that. The tightness is kind of determining how close together that duplicated version of what you're playing is next to what you're actually playing. And from what I can tell, it's controlling a range of delay. In truth, this tightness setting should have probably been named looseness, because the tightest setting is actually over here. Maybe my pod is wired backwards, who knows? But in my case at least, the best settings for, say, high tempo types of heavy metal, you want to start in this region and then bring it up to taste until stuff starts sounding sloppy, because there are plenty of genres that you want the guitars to be tracked more closely to one another, but there's also plenty that it sounds good with some slop. And I find slower pace clean material sounds really good with it all the way to the max. So that leads to the question that's probably on a lot of people's minds: how the hell are they doing it? What is the secret sauce algorithm under the hood? To gain some insight into that question, I decided to examine the raw waveform coming off this pedal in basically the settings you see here: 1 dub, tightness at noon. And my findings are pretty interesting. It's a fairly simple trick, but it's one I think I'm going to have a lot of trouble duplicating, since there are some unknowns and unknowns about the way they're doing it. So the first thing I think they're doing is a dynamic delay. What I mean by that is, say, like a regular delay pedal, you set it to every quarter note at this tempo. It happens every time at quarter note at that tempo, or 33 milliseconds if you want like slap back or something like that. This isn't that way, because if you align the waveform, say you get your dry and effect out, at first maybe the output will be 7 milliseconds behind, so you line that up, but then later down the line in the waveform you'll be off again, and so you can straighten that up, but then you'll be off somewhere else. So it seems like there's almost a step function of how much the other signal is off versus the other one, which is very smart, because I find that when playing with traditional Haas effects, you eventually have your ear trained towards it, to where it doesn't do anything anymore. You're like, yeah, I know this one's 7 milliseconds behind or 30 milliseconds behind. And you can't do that with this one. It's very natural sounding. It's very unpredictable in that way. I don't know if that's a straight modulation. I don't know if it's saying, okay, we're at 3 milliseconds, now we're gonna go down to 1, now we're gonna go up to 7, now we're gonna, I don't know if it's a step function, but it is some sort of dynamic delay, it appears. The other thing this appears to be doing is some very, very subtle modulation effects. And if you listen to just the raw output, you can't hear any pitch distortion, you can't hear like a chorus over top of it or anything, but comparing the raw waveforms, compared to baseline, there is some amplitude differences in certain parts of the wave. There are some frequency content differences, very subtle though. And it's a hell of an effect they're doing, because I think I would have a very hard time to replicate this in any digital modeling space. And I'll let you decide for yourself on all these demos, but to me, it's a very convincing effect, probably the closest I've ever heard. Now that you sort of know how this thing works, we will set it up in kind of the basic configuration with a guitar in front of 2 clean amplifiers, no other effects, and go through the full range of all the controls so you can hear exactly what each one does. I don't know about you, but I can name on one hand the amount of guitar players I know that don't use some sort of stomp box in their guitar rigs. So this thing needs to be compatible with them, and compatible it is. So for say distorted heavy metal guitars, you're probably using some sort of overdrive, and you can run that into 2 separate amplifiers in a couple different ways. Let's say you have one OD you really like, say a vintage tube screamer, you can put that before the pedal and it will split out into the amplifier inputs and it sounds fine. You could also say run 2 different distortion pedals or overdrive pedals. Say you've got a super overdrive that sounds better with 1 amp, but a tube screamer or a clean boost that sounds better with the other amp. You can run that after it. They advise to run single ODs before, but I find it works just fine in the other configuration as well. So here's where things get really interesting. I figured since things were going fairly well with the advertised setup of this pedal, I would try a few that aren't really sanctioned by TC, but I think work really well, or else I wouldn't be showing you in this exact video. So we're gonna try sort of a fancy slave out setup, and that will involve running straight into one amplifier, taking the effects send, plugging it in the mono input, taking the first stereo output and running it right back into the amplifier, so this thing is just a buffer at that point, and then taking the other stereo out and running it into a slave power amp. And that allows you to get a double tracked sound without having 2 different amplifier sounds if you don't own 2 different amps. Of course, you're gonna get some power amp coloration in there, but for the most part, it's gonna sound like a Mesa Boogie Mark IV if you're slaving a Mesa Boogie Mark IV out. And I didn't expect this to work so well because I figured the circuitry of this pedal was expecting, you know, kind of lower level clean guitar inputs. But as far as I can tell, sounds like a perfect copy to me. With that, I believe it's time to start some head-to-head shootouts with this pedal versus some competing methods. And we'll begin with the Fractal audio version, the enhancer block. As I mentioned before, this is a block that lies on the AX8 and the AXFX products that you put after your dry amplifier sound and generally before any other time-based effects if you're using them. And this is kind of a different take on the Haas effect, and you can do some stuff to tweak it to make it sound pretty good. The way I usually run it is for playing along with albums to get kind of a bigger depth. This is an effect I would practically never use on rhythm guitar presets, especially in the studio tracking, but even debatable on a live setting as well. But I thought we would see if the Mimiq could replace that effect for me and get a convincing double track guitar in the modeling space. For the traditional double track sound on rhythm guitars, this thing is definitely the champion in my book. And I was really impressed with how this doesn't color your sound, even after putting the fully processed guitar signal through it. I couldn't tell a difference, and if there is any sort of low pass, high pass coloration going on, it is very subtle and to the point that I don't care if I'm using it in that scenario because I'm not going to use this thing to track a real album with anyway. So if I'm just like using it to jam, no problem there, and very impressed by the results. So the ultimate test is, how does this thing fare against actual double tracking? Can you tell the difference between someone double tracking a guitar and simply playing one guitar through this? Can it be done? Let's see. This was the test that made me a real believer, and there are subtle differences and you can pick them up if you go through that loop as many times as I have, but the only surefire way I can tell is, as I mentioned before, a true kind of double track guitar sound is coming at you from what sounds like 180 degrees apart, right? You got like a speaker on each side of your head lined up perfectly with your ears. Whereas with the Mimiq effect channel, it sounds like the dry is there, but the effect is kind of over here. It's more towards the center, at least that's the way it sounds to me. And I think it's a pretty simple explanation. With a real double track guitar, you have more error, you have more inconsistency, you have more stuff separating the two. So you are going to get a larger stereo image. This isn't doing stuff like pick attack manipulation. You know, if you strike one note harder on one guitar versus the other, I don't think you're going to hear the difference. This might be doing some amplitude type modulation stuff, but you can't get the scraping effect in that sort of effect. So it is so damn close. I'm very impressed, and I would have no qualms about tracking a demo with this thing to save time, truly, for double track guitars that don't require a harmony section. So I will definitely be using it in that use case. I will definitely be putting this through the effects loop of my AX8, though you do sacrifice the effects loop at that point, but for direct stuff, I don't care. In conclusion, this is an extremely convincing effect, without a doubt the best double tracker I've ever played through. And it's easy for me to recommend for anyone that plays stereo rigs or wants to save some of their creative juices while, you know, kind of writing a demo and getting that double track sound immediately. If you have a mono rig, don't bother. I will say that again. This thing sucks for mono. There is no point in my opinion. But when you start getting into stereo stuff, hell yeah. So if you like that separated Ozzy Osbourne, you know, Blizzard of Oz era guitar sound that Randy Rhoads was so infamous for, you can get that sort of sound with a stereo rig. If you kind of like this as a chorus effect, maybe you can, replace a chorus with it or record using both. I think it sounds really great with the chorus. I simply didn't show it to show the, how transparent this pedal is. If you're playing live, again, I think that's a good thing. If you're using a slave damp, it works really well. For modelers, that gets a little bit more complicated. I find it really cool, but if you need the effects loop send on, say, the AX8, then maybe not. It depends on if it's worth sacrificing an onstage cab and still having a front of house output. But if you have an Axe-Fx 3 with all the ins and outs that it does and you're not happy with the enhancer block, not a bad upgrade over that. And lastly, I certainly wouldn't use this as a full-blown replacement for double tracking on anything that you're going to release to the public, but for writing music and getting a more finished state sound earlier, I think it's very, very valuable for that. Just hook it up to my interface, load up some VST plugins, and get a really convincing double tracking sound. So I was way more impressed with this thing than I thought I was going to. I figured I'd make this video and flip this pedal immediately, but I'm going to keep it. I really like it a lot, and look forward to how I can integrate it into rigs in the future. TC Electronic, they're a little hit and miss for me. I've got a few of their products. A lot of their stuff I'm not a fan of, but this one they did a great job on. So kudos to TC on that one. Any questions, comments, as always, please leave them below, and we will see you later down the road with more gear reviews like this one. Thanks for watching. Bye.